In 1975, an engineer built a toaster-sized machine that could capture a photograph without film. It took 23 seconds to record a single black and white image at 0.01 megapixels. He brought it to his executives and demonstrated it proudly. Their reaction, as he remembered it years later: "That's cute, but don't tell anyone about it." The engineer worked for Kodak. The machine was the first digital camera in the world. Kodak didn't miss the future. Kodak invented it, and then spent the next 3 decades trying to make sure nobody noticed. It's still one of the most cited case studies in business schools today. Not because the technology failed, but because the company that invented it chose to bury it instead. Eastman Kodak was founded in 1888 by George Eastman, built on a simple idea: photography should be simple enough for anyone. "You press the button, we do the rest," was the company's slogan, and for most of the 20th century, it was essentially true. Kodak didn't just sell cameras, it sold film, and film was the real business. Every roll shot meant another roll bought, developed, and printed over and over for the life of the customer. By the 1970s, Kodak controlled roughly 90% of film sales and 85% of camera sales in the United States. It employed over 100,000 people, most of them in a single city, Rochester, New York, which depended on the company almost entirely. Kodak wasn't just a business. It was one of the most valuable, most trusted brands in the world. The kind of company that showed up in Fortune's list of most admired companies year after year, decade after decade. The phrase Kodak moment entered everyday language as shorthand for a moment worth capturing. That's how deeply the brand had fused itself with the very idea of a photograph. That's what makes what happened next so strange. In 1975, a young Kodak engineer named Steven Sasson was asked to explore whether a camera could capture images electronically, without film at all. He built a prototype out of spare parts: a lens from a Super 8 camera, a novel image sensor, and a cassette tape to store the data. It worked. It just wasn't very good. 23 seconds to take a picture, and the image could only be viewed on a television screen. Sasson demonstrated it to a room of Kodak executives. As he told it in later interviews, they were fascinated and mildly amused, and then very clear about one thing: this was not something to discuss outside the room. Kodak's entire empire ran on people buying film over and over. A camera that needed no film at all wasn't an innovation to Kodak's leadership. It was a threat to the only business model the company had ever known. Sasson patented the device, U.S. Patent 4131,919. And decades later, in 2010, he received the National Medal of Technology and Innovation from the White House for it, an invention that had spent most of its life locked away inside the company that built it. So Kodak did something unusual. It kept inventing the future, quietly, patenting its digital discoveries by the thousand, and simultaneously did almost everything it could to keep that future from arriving on schedule. For the next 2 decades, Kodak wasn't asleep. It built an enormous portfolio of digital imaging patents. Engineers there kept refining sensors, compression, storage. But the company treated digital photography as a research project to be managed, not a product to be sold aggressively. Executives worried, correctly, that every digital camera sold was a customer who would eventually stop buying film. Kodak did release digital cameras eventually, starting in the 1990s, but usually late, overpriced, and undermarketed compared to Japanese competitors like Canon and Sony, who had no legacy film business to protect. Every quarterly earnings call reinforced the same incentive. Film margins were enormous, digital margins were thin or negative, and Wall Street rewarded whichever numbers looked better that quarter, not the ones that mattered a decade out. Meanwhile, Kodak kept investing in what it knew: film manufacturing, photo finishing kiosks, one-hour print labs, infrastructure built for a world that was quietly disappearing around it. By the time smartphones added cameras in the mid-2000s, the shift that Kodak's own invention had made possible 30 years earlier finally happened all at once, and it happened without Kodak. The company that owned the original patent for capturing a photo without film watched a wave of digital cameras, and then phone cameras, wash over the market it once controlled almost completely. Here's the part of the story people usually skip. Kodak's failure wasn't a failure of invention or even foresight. Its engineers saw digital coming before almost anyone else on Earth. The failure was structural. Kodak's entire financial identity, its factories, its Rochester workforce, its relationships with retailers, all of it was built around a business where the camera was cheap and the film was the profit. Digital photography broke that model completely. There was no film to sell, no repeat purchase, no recurring revenue engine to protect. It's the same razor and blade logic that built companies like Gillette. Sell the handle cheap, profit from the blades forever. Except Kodak's blades were rolls of film, and digital photography made the blades obsolete overnight. A company that had spent a century optimizing for razor and blade economics couldn't easily become a company that sold a single camera once and made nothing after that. So instead of committing fully to the new model early, when Kodak still had the resources and the brand to lead it, the company tried to slow the transition down, to buy the film business more time, one fiscal quarter at a time. That strategy worked for a while. Every year it worked was a year the competition got stronger and Kodak's core business got smaller. By the early 2000s, Kodak finally shifted its strategy toward digital in earnest. But by then, the company was competing from behind against rivals with a decade's head start and none of Kodak's legacy costs. Film sales, which had funded the whole company for a century, began collapsing year after year as camera phones went mainstream. Kodak's stock, which had traded above $90 a share in the late 1990s, was worth pennies by the time the bankruptcy filing became public, and a workforce that had once numbered well over 100,000 people had been cut down to a small fraction of that. On January 19, 2012, Eastman Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. In the years around the filing, the company sold off roughly 1,100 digital imaging patents, the very invention Sasson and his colleagues had built decades earlier, for about $525 million, to a consortium that included Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Samsung. The technology Kodak had once been told not to talk about was now worth $500 million to the companies that had actually built businesses around it. Kodak emerged from bankruptcy in 2013, a fraction of its former size, focused mostly on commercial printing. Its crosstown rival in film, Japan's Fujifilm, took its film chemistry expertise into cosmetics and pharmaceuticals instead of fighting digital head-on, and survived the same disruption that ended Kodak's century at the top. So what actually killed Kodak? It wasn't a failure to see the future. Kodak saw it before anyone and built it in a lab in 1975. It wasn't even a failure to patent it. Kodak owned the intellectual property all the way to the end. The real mistake was treating a company-defining invention as a threat to be managed instead of a business to be built, because building it honestly would have required admitting that the old business was already over. By the time Kodak tried to compete on digital's terms, the years it had spent protecting film had handed the entire market to companies with nothing to protect. The companies that survive disruption aren't always the ones who invent the future first. They're the ones willing to let their own invention put them out of their old business, before someone else does it for them. Kodak had 30 years and the only patent that mattered. It still wasn't enough.